There is a circuit in your brain actively sabotaging your ability to feel satisfaction. Evolution put it there 200,000 years ago, and right now, at this exact moment, it is running at full capacity, burning through your dopamine reserves like a wildfire through dry grass. This is not a metaphor. This is not self-help poetry. This is a biological fact that Stanford neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky has spent decades documenting in laboratory conditions, and what he discovered should terrify you. Your dopamine system was designed for a world where rewards were scarce and survival was uncertain. A world where finding a handful of berries triggered a neural celebration because it meant you would not starve today. A world where every calorie mattered, every moment of pleasure was earned through physical effort, and your brain could afford to give you that hit of satisfaction because tomorrow you would be back to the baseline struggle. That system made perfect evolutionary sense. It kept your ancestors alive, but that system is now killing you in slow motion. Here is what happened. You took that ancient reward circuit, perfectly calibrated for scarcity, and you dropped it into an environment of infinite abundance. An environment where you can trigger dopamine release 200 times before breakfast without moving from your bed. Scroll, notification, like, message, video, swipe, repeat. Your biological machinery was never stress tested for this level of stimulation. It is like taking an engine designed for dirt roads and running it at maximum RPM on a highway for 16 hours a day. Eventually, something breaks, and what breaks is your ability to feel anything at all. The technical term is hedonic adaptation, but that sanitizes what is actually happening inside your skull. Your brain is not adapting. It is drowning. Every time you get a hit of easy dopamine, your system compensates by down-regulating receptors. Fewer receptors means you need more stimulation to feel the same effect. More stimulation means more down-regulation. This is not a choice you are making. This is automatic biological regulation happening below the level of conscious awareness. You are not weak. You are not undisciplined. You are experiencing the predictable outcome of placing Paleolithic hardware in a digital environment it was never designed to handle. Let me be specific about what this looks like in real time. You wake up and immediately reach for your phone, not because you consciously decided to, but because your dopamine system has learned that this behavior produces reliable reward. You scroll for 30 minutes. Each swipe, each new piece of content triggers a small dopamine pulse. Individually, these pulses are tiny. Collectively, they are flooding your system. By the time you stand up, you have already blown through more dopamine hits than your ancestors experienced in a week. And now, you're supposed to sit down and focus on work that requires sustained attention and delayed gratification. This is not a fair fight. This is bringing a knife to a gunfight, except the gun is pointed at your own prefrontal cortex. The CEO of your brain, the part that handles planning and impulse control and long-term thinking, runs on the same dopamine currency as everything else. When you deplete your dopamine reserves chasing easy hits, you are literally draining the neurochemical fuel that powers your ability to resist chasing more easy hits. This is the trap. This is why every productivity system you have tried has failed. You are not failing because you lack willpower. You are failing because you are trying to override a biological feedback loop that operates on a time scale of milliseconds while you're thinking on a time scale of days. Your brain does not care about your goals. Your brain cares about survival, and in the ancestral environment, maximizing immediate reward was survival. The organism that stopped to think about long-term consequences while standing in front of ripe fruit did not pass on its genes. You are descended from the organisms that grabbed the fruit first and thought about it later. That impulse is hardwired. That impulse is not going anywhere. What you can do is change the environment so that the impulse pushes you toward behaviors that serve your actual interests instead of hijacking them. This is what a dopamine detox actually is, not some mystical cleanse, not a moral judgment about technology. It is environmental engineering applied to your own neurobiology. It is recognizing that you cannot win a willpower battle against a system that was optimized by millions of years of selection pressure. So instead, you change the battlefield. Let me pause here for a second and ask you a question that maybe no one has ever asked you. What is the worst part of living with this internal struggle? Not what you tell people, but the part you carry in silence. I want you to know something. What you are feeling is more common than you imagine. Thousands of people are watching this video right now, carrying exactly the same weight. If you have the courage, leave a comment telling me what is the hardest part for you. Your honesty might make someone else feel less alone today. Now, let me continue showing you how to break this pattern. The protocol I am about to walk you through is not original. The underlying principles come from addiction neuroscience, behavioral psychology, and evolutionary biology. What I have done is compress decades of peer-reviewed research into a 30-day framework that you can actually execute without requiring a PhD or a monastery. This works because it works with your biology instead of against it. This works because it accepts what you are, a dopamine-driven organism, and uses that fact as leverage instead of treating it as a character flaw. Day 1 through 7 is going to feel like punishment. I need you to understand this going in so you do not misinterpret what is happening. You are not getting worse. You are experiencing withdrawal. When you remove the easy dopamine sources, your down-regulated receptors do not instantly bounce back. There is a lag period where you have low baseline dopamine and fewer receptors to detect it. This is the valley. This is where most people quit because they interpret feeling worse as evidence that the protocol is not working. Feeling worse is evidence that the protocol is working. You are in acute withdrawal from a substance that your brain categorizes the same way it categorizes cocaine. During week 1, you are going to remove every source of easy dopamine from your immediate environment. This means your phone goes in a drawer in another room. This means no social media, no video games, no streaming services, no news feeds, no infinite scroll of any kind. This means when you sit down to eat, you eat. No podcast, no video, no second screen. Just food and your thoughts. This will be almost unbearably boring. That is the point. Boredom is not a problem to solve. Boredom is information. Boredom is your brain telling you that it has become dependent on external stimulation to regulate its own internal state. Boredom is the signal that you need this protocol more than you thought. The biological mechanism at work here is called receptor upregulation. When you stop flooding the system, the brain compensates by building more receptors to capture what little dopamine is available. More receptors means the same baseline level of dopamine produces a stronger signal. A stronger signal means activities that used to feel pointless, reading a book, going for a walk, having a conversation with no agenda, start to feel rewarding again. This process takes time. The research suggests significant upregulation begins around day 7 to 10. Full recovery of baseline function can take 30 to 90 days depending on how deep the hole is. You are not trying to eliminate dopamine. You are trying to reset your sensitivity so that normal human activities feel worth doing again. Week 2 is where you start replacing the removed behaviors with low dopamine alternatives. This is critical. You cannot just create a vacuum and expect your brain to sit quietly. Your brain will fill that vacuum with whatever is available, and if you have not provided structured alternatives, it will find a way back to the old patterns. The alternatives need to meet 3 criteria. They need to be immediately accessible, they need to require physical effort, and they need to have no built-in termination point. Walking is perfect. You can walk right now. Walking requires your body to move through space, which activates proprioceptive feedback loops and shifts your neurochemical state in ways that scrolling never will. Walking has no natural endpoint. You can walk for 10 minutes or 2 hours. The activity itself does not push you toward more activity the way algorithmic content does. Exercise in general meets these criteria. Lifting heavy objects, running until your lungs burn, any form of deliberate physical stress will trigger dopamine release, but it will be dopamine tied to real effort and real adaptation. Your brain knows the difference. Your brain can tell when it earned the reward versus when it just clicked a button. Reading from physical books meets the criteria. No hyperlinks, no notifications, no infinite scroll. You read until you decide to stop, not until an algorithm decides to release you. Cooking actual food from actual ingredients meets the criteria. The process takes time, requires attention, produces a tangible result. These are not sophisticated interventions. These are the activities that humans did for thousands of generations before we invented the attention extraction industry. Your biology expects these activities. Your biology is starving for these activities. Week 3 is about rebuilding your tolerance for frustration. This is going to sound strange, but one of the most damaging effects of easy dopamine is that it destroys your ability to persist through difficulty. When your brain learns that relief is always one click away, it stops building the neural infrastructure for delayed gratification. The prefrontal cortex, the CEO of your brain, strengthens through use. Every time you choose long-term benefit over immediate relief, you are literally building the neural pathways that make the next choice slightly easier. Every time you choose immediate relief, you are pruning those pathways. This is why discipline feels impossible when you are deep in the dopamine hole. You do not have the infrastructure to support it. So week 3 is about installing that infrastructure. Pick one thing that you have been avoiding because it is difficult. Not impossible, just difficult. Learning a language, working on a creative project, building something with your hands, studying a technical subject. Commit to 30 minutes a day with no escape hatch, no music, no podcast, no second screen, just you and the difficulty. The first session will be agonizing. The 10th session will be merely unpleasant. The 20th session will feel almost normal. By session 30, you will have built enough frustration tolerance that difficult work no longer triggers the same panic response. The mechanism here is stress adaptation. Your brain contains a structure called the amygdala that functions as a threat detector. When you encounter difficulty, the amygdala signals threat and your system floods with cortisol and adrenaline. This is appropriate if you are being chased by a predator. This is not appropriate if you are trying to learn calculus. But your amygdala cannot tell the difference between physical danger and mental effort. Both register as threat. The way you train the amygdala is through repeated exposure to manageable stress. You show it that difficulty is not danger. You show it that you can persist through discomfort and nothing catastrophic happens. Over time, the threat signal weakens. Over time, difficulty becomes just another input instead of an emergency. This is not motivational speaking. This is classical conditioning applied to your own nervous system. Week 4 is integration. This is where you start adding back selected sources of digital dopamine under controlled conditions. Notice I said selected and controlled. You are not going back to the baseline pattern. You are establishing a new baseline pattern where you control the exposure instead of the exposure controlling you. The principle is called environmental design. You make the behaviors you want effortless, and the behaviors you want to avoid require friction. Practical implementation looks like this. Your phone stays in another room unless you are actively using it for a specific purpose. Not checking if anything happened. A specific purpose. You have specific times when you check messages. Twice a day, 3 times a day. Whatever number makes sense for your life. But it is a decision you make in advance. Not a decision your brainstem makes in the moment. Social media, if you use it at all, exists only on your computer, not on your phone. This creates friction. You have to be in a specific location to access it. This gives your prefrontal cortex time to intervene. The research on environmental design is clear. Willpower is a finite resource that depletes with use. The more decisions you have to make, the worse your decision-making becomes. This is why surgeons and presidents wear the same outfit every day. They are conserving decision-making capacity for the choices that actually matter. You cannot rely on willpower to resist dopamine hits when the dopamine source is in your pocket and your brain has been conditioned for years to reach for it automatically. What you can do is remove the source from your pocket. What you can do is make the reach require 10 seconds of conscious thought instead of 0 seconds of reflexive action. 10 seconds is enough time for the CEO of your brain to get involved. By the end of 30 days, if you execute this protocol with genuine commitment, you will notice 3 things. First, your baseline mood will be higher, not because anything external has changed, but because your dopamine receptors have upregulated to the point where normal life feels rewarding again. Second, your ability to focus will have increased dramatically, not because you suddenly developed superhuman concentration, but because you are no longer constantly diverting attention to check for digital rewards. Third, and this is the most important, you will have rebuilt trust with yourself. You will have proven to yourself that you can commit to something difficult and follow through. That evidence changes everything. This is where we need to talk about relapse, because relapse is guaranteed. You are going to have a day where you fall back into the old pattern. You are going to wake up and immediately reach for your phone. You are going to scroll for an hour without even realizing what happened. This is not failure. This is biology. The neural pathways you built over years of repetition do not disappear in 30 days. They get weaker, but they are still there, waiting for the right trigger to reactivate them. What matters is not whether you relapse. What matters is how quickly you recognize it and course correct. The Stoic philosopher Seneca wrote that we suffer more in imagination than in reality. The worst part of relapse is not the relapse itself. It is the story you tell yourself about the relapse. The story where this proves you are weak, this proves you cannot change, this proves you should just give up and accept your limitations. That story is not evidence-based. That story is your brain trying to protect itself from the discomfort of sustained effort by convincing you that sustained effort is pointless. Do not believe your brain when it tells you this. Your brain is not trying to help you. Your brain is trying to conserve energy. What you do instead is treat relapse as data. You relapsed. That means there was a trigger you did not account for. Maybe you were stressed, maybe you were bored, maybe you were in a specific location that you associate with the old behavior. Identify the trigger, adjust the protocol to address that trigger, execute again. This is not moral theater, this is experimental iteration. You are not trying to become a perfect human. You are trying to build a system that works for your specific neurobiology in your specific environment. That system will require constant adjustment. That is not a bug, that is a feature. I want to address something that nobody talks about, which is that you are going to lose people during this process. Not everybody, but some. There are people in your life right now who are invested in you staying exactly as you are. Maybe because your dysfunction makes them feel better about their own. Maybe because your availability for distraction validates their own behavior patterns. Maybe because they genuinely do not understand why you would voluntarily make yourself uncomfortable when comfort is available. These people will not support this change. These people will actively or passively sabotage it. This is another biological reality. Humans are social primates. We form hierarchies. Hierarchies stabilize when everyone knows their place. When you change, you destabilize the hierarchy. You create uncertainty about where you fit and where everyone else fits relative to you. Some people respond to that uncertainty with curiosity and support. Some people respond with hostility and sabotage. You cannot control which response you get. What you can control is whether you allow someone else's discomfort to prevent your growth. The research on social contagion shows that behavior spreads through networks. If the people around you are deep in the dopamine hole, they will pull you back in through 1,000 subtle mechanisms. Invitations to scroll together, jokes about your new weird habits, concerned trolling disguised as care. You are not required to defend your choices to anyone. You are not required to explain the neuroscience of receptor upregulation to someone who is not asking in good faith. What you're required to do, if you actually want this to work, is protect your environment during the vulnerable period when new habits are forming. That might mean spending less time with certain people. That might mean having uncomfortable conversations about boundaries. That might mean accepting that some relationships were built on shared dysfunction and cannot survive you getting healthy. This sounds harsh. This is reality. You are allowed to prioritize your own neurochemical stability over someone else's comfort with your old behavior patterns. Let me give you the evolutionary frame that makes all of this make sense. Your ancestors lived in small tribes of about 150 people. Those were the only people who mattered. Those were the only people whose opinions affected your survival. Your brain is still wired for that environment. Your brain treats social rejection as a threat to survival because in the ancestral environment it was. If the tribe cast you out, you died. That fear is real. That fear is adaptive. But the tribe is gone. You are not going to die because some people are uncomfortable with your choices. You are going to die slowly If you stay in an environment that is constantly triggering your dopamine system into dysregulation, the choice is not between comfort and growth. The choice is between the discomfort of change and the discomfort of staying exactly where you are. Both paths are uncomfortable. Only one path leads somewhere you actually want to go. Here is what nobody tells you about doing hard things. It does not get easier. You get stronger. The difficulty remains the same. Your capacity to handle difficulty increases. This is not semantics. This is the difference between hoping the world will accommodate your limitations and building the capability to handle the world as it actually is. The world does not care about your dopamine receptors. The world does not care that you are descendant from organisms that were optimized for scarcity. The world is what it is. You can spend your life resenting that fact, or you can spend your life adapting to it. Adaptation is not effortless. Adaptation is the opposite of effortless. But adaptation is possible in ways that changing reality is not. This is the Stoic insight. This is what Marcus Aurelius meant when he wrote that the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. The difficulty is not blocking your path. The difficulty is the path. Every moment of frustration, every moment of boredom, every moment where you want to reach for your phone and you do not, that is you building the neural infrastructure that will support the life you claim you want. Most people never build that infrastructure. Most people spend their entire lives confusing what they want in the moment with what they want from life. These are not the same thing. What you want in the moment is relief from discomfort. What you want from life is meaning, competence, connection, the feeling that your existence matters beyond your own immediate sensory experience. You cannot get the second thing by optimizing for the first thing. They are pointing in opposite directions. The protocol I have given you is a tool for getting what you want from life by temporarily ignoring what you want in the moment. This is not deprivation. This is strategy. This is recognizing that the unit of measure that matters is not how you feel right now, but how you feel about yourself when you look back on the choices you made. Your future self is watching you make this choice. Your future self is the version of you who has to live with the consequences of what you do today. You can betray that person, or you can build something they will thank you for. That is the only choice that matters. If you made it this far, I already know something important about you. You do not just want to survive your own mind, you want to master it. This channel is not about magic promises. It is about real people sharing real tools that work in the real world. If this makes sense to you, subscribe to the channel, not because I am asking, but because you deserve a place where you can learn to build the version of yourself you always knew was in there. Biology is destiny until you hack it. This content is for educational and entertainment purposes only. The concepts presented are theoretical frameworks for understanding human behavior and should not replace professional medical or psychological